Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. We are standing between the people in the room and their drinks. So let's make it worth their while. We've been given an hour to have a chat about so what now? And I'm going to start with Nishan. I haven't quite figured out the order in which we're going to go. I'm going to start with Nishan because I'm not being ageist. It's just because I've seen Nishan in the room for most of the last 2 days. So we're going to start with him. But before I get to Nishan, I want to just introduce the panelists very briefly in the order in which they are sitting, starting with Nishan. Nishan is the executive director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, who's been an activist for a long time, from teacher unionism to civil organizing to youth activism and the formal underground of the ANC in the past. Tessa Dooms is director of the Rivonia Circle. She's trained as a sociologist and a development practitioner and a political analyst. And she's worked in government, she's worked in NGOs and in the private sector. Professor Themba Masego is head of the Wits School of Governance. Many of you will know him from his previous lives. Director General in the past of the Department of Public Works and of the Department of Public Service and Administration. But most famously or infamously, I don't know which one it is, he was CEO of GCIS, who was unceremoniously removed, as most of you know. So those, and then of course, closest to me, is Thandi Matthews. Thandi is an attorney and an academic who works in law and human rights. Currently, she's completing a PhD on the relationship between constitutionalism, socio-economic rights, and social policy to address systemic inequalities in South Africa. So Nishan, let me start with an easy question for you. Where are you landing after being in this conversation for the last couple of days? Where are we and how do we go forward?
You know, two things. One, I listened to the presentation of the presidency, and I thought we were very gentle, because here was a report from the highest office in the land, prepared on its own, monitored by itself, accounting by itself, in the most uncritical fashion. And I really thought that was a huge missed opportunity not to have interrogated that, the assumptions of that report, the premise on which it was prepared, and the limited scope. Because whilst it was responding to the Zondo Commission, it didn't respond to the fact that state capture has moved beyond the perimeters of the Zondo Commission, but spreads to almost every structure of government across the country today. And I think that that's a huge missed opportunity from ourselves here. But I think the second thing, I asked myself, what would we do here today if Mosebenzi Zwane, Ace Magashule, and others had registered for this conference and had come in and had sat here? What would we do? I don't think we know what to do. And I tell you why. Yet Des van Rooyen gets appointed to a board in the Gauteng provincial government. And we're almost all quiet. We're quiet. We listen to the MEC saying, well, they're not guilty, they haven't been charged, and they've got some qualifications, and whatever Zondo said doesn't matter. Now, I think of any staff in those entities that has to now go before these characters and go and talk about good governance. So I think we have been very placid, we've been very respectful, but I think civil society as a whole has lost its anger on the issue of state capture and corruption. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. We've been blasted, you say, and I'm hoping we'll get some fire from Tandy and from Tessa. But before I come to the two of you, Temba, I want to come to you next. You see, I'm working out the order in which I'm going as we go along. And I want to come to you also I think, to pick up on what Nishan has said, which is that, and we've heard this throughout this conference, the way it was put here, by somebody yesterday was that corruption, state capture, always morphs. But also, I think our response, as Nishan is telling us, has also morphed. It has been changing. He says we've arrived at a place where we're placid. From where you are sitting, and I don't presume you've been part of the discussions or following the proceedings for the last 2 days, so you're coming in fresh in some ways. But from where you're sitting, in terms of where we've got to in our response to state capture, what's your take?
Okay, let me say, if you're going by age, I should have gone before Nishan in this conversation.
I did say I'm not ageist.
No, look, I would share the sentiment that civil society, although it has played quite a vital role in the fight against state capture, and in fact, by civil society, one would include the media playing a key role in terms of mobilizing or informing society about state capture and the damage it is causing to society and the psyche of our society. And I think that role will remain in the minds of many of us who lived through that period. My concern is that clearly the state is dragging its feet in terms of implementing the recommendations of the Zondo Commission, largely because many of the decision makers who are supposed to be responsible for implementing those recommendations are themselves somehow implicated in that report. So it is not surprising that, in fact, the pace of implementing those recommendations is as slow as it is. But I think that civil society, as I said, played a vital role in the past, and I think it still can play an important role, most importantly in terms of mobilizing society. My worry is that there are a lot of conversations such as these ones, where we talk about what needs to be done to make sure that the recommendations are implemented. But a lot of our conversations tend to be amongst ourselves as people who know what's happening. People have some ideas about what needs to be done, but we're leaving our citizens behind in those conversations. And I said in the conference, I think it was last year or year before, it is absolutely vital that we keep our citizens informed. And I'm talking about ordinary people now in the townships, in the suburbs, and make sure that the conversations about corruption, the need to fight against corruption and implementation of the Zondo Commission, it's a conversation that also needs to involve ordinary citizens. And I think that the people who can lead that conversation in our communities are yourselves, civil society. I think you have a vital role to play in terms of mobilizing society and making sure that we keep society informed about what is or what is not happening or what government is not doing as far as the recommendations of the Zondo Commission are concerned. But can I just add on and just say some of the points that I think are quite vital in talking about this. So mobilizing society, making sure that society is informed about what's happening and what is not happening about the recommendations. In other words, finding ways of making sure that we continue to put pressure on the state to implement these recommendations. The reason why there's slow movement is because the state is not feeling the citizens, putting pressure on them to make sure that they act. Secondly, civil society, I think we also have an important role to play in terms of making sure that we begin to influence policy decisions that are being made by the state. And I was pleased talking to some people in the Department of Justice who said that a lot of civil society organizations have made submissions on the new recommendations about how the whole whistleblower legislation needs to be amended. So it's clear that, in fact, as civil society, we're already thinking about policy issues, but I think that we need to make sure that we make those submissions not quietly to the state, but also begin to inform society about what we're doing. And as I said, thirdly, we need to create platforms such as these ones in communities, because it's fine for us to sit as activists, but at the end of the day, we need to reach out to communities out there. But you also have an important role to play. Cynthia has already indicated about the kind of support that you can do as civil society. It's not your primary responsibility, but civil society can play an important role to make sure that you support those heroes, the whistleblowers, in various ways. These include providing psychosocial support, not just to whistleblowers themselves, but also to their families. It's already been mentioned that we need to provide support, financial support. Somehow, models still need to be worked out about how this is provided. There's security support required. The whistleblower house is already doing that. But there's also legal support that needs to be provided to whistleblowers. But we also need to talk about professional bodies, who I consider as part of civil society, that we need to put pressure on these professional bodies, your accounting organizations, legal organizations, and other institutions, to make sure that, in fact, they act against their own members who were implicated in state capture. Not enough is being done. Some associations are starting to act against their members who are implicated in state capture. But we also need to make sure that they also contribute in the conversation about strengthening the regulatory framework to make sure that we prevent instances of state capture in the future. They must also make sure that they provide ethics education to their members as professionals, because state capture would not have been possible if professionals working in consulting firms, in law firms, accounting firms were not supporting the state capturers, so to speak. So I think that's an important role that civil society can play. But yes, I think that the pace is slow. Much more pressure needs to be put on the state to make sure that recommendations are implemented.
Thank you. So the state is not feeling the pressure. We need forums in communities. And let me come to you, Tessa, because I know that that element, that thread that Themba has put to us, is something that you at the Rivonia Circle, you in your own work are taking quite seriously. I know Nishan, of course, Kathrada Foundation, Defend Our Democracy. That's also something that you're taking quite seriously. So what do those conversations look like, Tessa? Let's use that as a jumping off point and then add whatever else that you had prepared.
Yeah. So what do those conversations look like, or what should they look like? I think are different questions. What they do look like right now in terms of conversations, amongst communities of people living, we're all living our lives in different ways. But professional civil society is having a very different experience of this country right now than social movements, activists, and community members are in particularly low-income and impoverished and marginalized communities. And I think that it's not so much that the majority of South Africans don't understand the consequence of everything that's going wrong. It's that there's a lack of the details of what's going wrong. And there's a lack of the details of how bad things really are, within government and all of its structures, and how much the state is falling apart. So I think even for us in this room, I sometimes think that even we are siloed in our thoughts about how bad things are, and that we're all looking very narrowly at one crack in the wall, very deeply and intensely, when there's a multiplicity of cracks and the damn wall is about to break. And so what it looks like is a society that is not only fixated very deeply on our own experience of the crisis. We feel isolated, all of us. We feel helpless, all of us. And we are demobilized, all of us. There's a desperation in this country right now And people feel desperate because we all feel alone. And I think that's our greatest challenge that we face right now as a country. Stembete gave a shocking stat about 2 weeks ago when she said on average this year there's been 26 protests a day in South Africa. The country is actually on fire. And that deep sense of despair that we feel when we look at the work that we're doing is only multiplied in other parts of the country where people are less informed about the state of the country, but feeling its consequences much more. And so what does it look like? It looks like a country that I'm starting to make the analogy that perhaps we're in 1985 and we don't realize it. That in fact we are really in the grips of what could easily be a people's state of emergency. But we don't realize it because we have a veneer of democracy that's holding up really by bare skins and strings. And maybe what is needed and what it needs to look like is a lot more cross-pollinated conversations, as Temba has said. We need to be having conversations that actually are attuned to what I call radical solidarity. I think in the 80s, class solidarity was important and possible because the majority of everyone was in the working class. The truth is right now, we are, in this room are the middle class of the society, not the working class. We don't represent the majority. We are barely connected to the majority of people who are affected by this crisis. And so we need a radical solidarity that says we have to break beyond the things that affect us, and we have to break towards the things that affect others more deeply than they affect us. And so I'll say more about the ways I think that we've gotten here and how I think we get out of it as we go in the conversation. But I just want us to sit with the reality that we are in a burning, burning country. We are demobilized, we are isolated, and we do all feel desperate, but we don't know what to do because we can't see each other.
Thank you, Tessa. One of the threads that have run through in terms of, in the last 2 days is precisely, I think, the point you're pointing towards, that radical solidarity is necessary. But the one thing that we've kept hitting upon is that in order to move things forward, we need to change our politics. And Thandi, I'm going to ask you to just help us think a little bit, start from that point of thinking, what does changing our politics look like? We've talked about parliament, and the way, I landed at the end of that conversation yesterday, where I landed was thinking, parliament, perhaps of the three arms of the state, is the most tone deaf, still is to this day. We've talked about, the funding of political parties and the way in which that needs to change. But there's a bigger change in our politics that's needed. Where do you think that change is that we need at this point?
So, Mungiseni, I'm not as pessimistic. I'm a constitutionalist, and we live in a world currently where the backlash to constitutionalism is quite profound. From the US, we see the backlash on democracy globally in what we call the context of illiberal democracy. And so being on our continent with the power of our constitution, I do think a lot of change is possible. One of the things that I think is necessary, though, is that we do need to better define what state capture actually is. I think something that has been lost on us is that the broad definition means that we don't know how to monitor intervention. And so broadly, state capture is defined as private interests that significantly influence the state's decision-making processes. But we know that this process started as a consequence of a few individuals that we felt influenced the state. We don't really look at the broader implications of private-public partnerships and the implications of that on service delivery and what that then means for deepening systemic inequalities in our country. So something that I think is really important is that we need to start thinking about the implications of state capture on social policy. Good governance does not necessarily mean that we're going to start developing policy that addresses systemic inequalities in our country. And I think that's something that we've really overlooked. We focus a lot on accountability. We focus a lot on political leaders. We don't focus enough on the quality of our social policy, how our budgets are being redistributed, why South Africa remains the most unequal country in the world. And that, of course, reinforces the 26 protests that we see a day. The other thing that I'd like to mention is that we also can't be selective in our approach about who we target when we want to monitor the implications of state capture. Something that we haven't really investigated enough of is what happened to the desalination plants in the Western Cape. 500 million rand was spent on those desalination plants. We're not sure what's happened to them. And so when we think about public-private partnerships and state-owned entities, who are we really focusing on and why? I do think we need to think about the racialized implications of how we monitor corruption in our country. And then lastly, I think if we are able to understand that the state is not a monolith, that we need to start thinking a bit differently about how we monitor human rights implementation in our country. We need to start to understand the state as a social entity. How do people work within the state? Who are the people that have decision-making powers? What are the implications of procurement policies, etc.? These dynamics, I mean, one of our previous speakers spoke about the fact that procurement policies in the state are really difficult for ordinary people to follow. If you're a secretary working for a director and you don't know the implications of not filing your requisitions on time, or that might get you a bad audit rating, what does that then mean for effective governance within our state entities? So I do think we need to focus more on studying the nature of the state and what it means for our democracy in the context of our constitution to advance the goals and objectives and values of our constitutional dispensation. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't put that in your mind. I didn't pay Tandi to say that about how we need to study the state, even though that's what Parry does. Let me open it up. I think we've got about just under 40 minutes. I don't want to stick with the panel too much. I want us to to open up this conversation for all of us to have it. How do we go forward from here? We've asked the panel to just start us off with offering us some provocations. We've heard the provocations. How are they landing for you? Let's hear some thoughts. You've been here for 2 days. What do you think? Where do we go from here? Carol. Okay, I'll give you this.
Thanks very much. It's Carol Payton from News 24. I'd like to hear from the panelists, where will political change come from? What we need is political change. What we have at the moment is every person starting their own political party. Where's change going to come? Or we have the oldies, in Defend Democracy, who have meetings and do nothing. Where will political change come from?
Thanks, Carol. Let's take those two inputs there. Oh, and before we come to you, just a quick note. Riyadh wants us to know that Jeff Wicks's film on Babita Deokaran is now available on News 24 for subscribers at R4 per month. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I want to start from Carol Payton's last point. Who are we or who I am? I'm probably amongst the oldest, not as old as Judge Crickler, but as older than maybe Dave Lewis. We cut our teeth politically in the early 70s. And I thought maybe we out of steam. And I see amongst here a lot of much younger people with shining intellects. And maybe we need a new kind of activism and a new kind of thinking to kind of grapple with what's required now. But besides that, I made a few other points over the last 2 days. I thought amongst the things that were said here, Michael Sachs said amongst the most profound. I mean, he said that we blame too much on state capture, and I think he's right. The mess that the country is in, and it's not a total mess. I mean, I think there's two big differences between 1985 and now. In 1985, we didn't have a legitimate government. Now we have a government that may have lost its way, but is based on the will of all the people. It's a democratically elected government. It's a government that has delivered on a number of things, but has also gone wrong. And part of the problem is what does change entail, and what does political change entail? When the ANC, because of what it has represented, will continue to be quite strong. I mean, the worst case scenario, I mean, that they're saying, they will get below 50, but over 40. So what does that mean politically? And how should we, and who are we? I mean, some of us belong to the ANC, we belong to civil society, but civil society isn't, I think Tessa is right, we have professional civil society. A civil society comprised of 9 to 11 full-time staff, a board of 14 to 15 people, donor-driven largely. They're not community-based organizations. They're not the organizations we had in the 70s and 80s, on the basis of which we got 1994 together. You know, it was that generation that brought 1994. And we may be a new generation to emerge from the fire we are in. I mean, the oldies may have a role to play, but not the role they played in the 70s and 80s. I mean, I can't see myself, I mean, playing the role. I mean, I remember someone saying in the 80s, we had asked people in the 50s we considered to be older. We took them away from their homes and from the factories. We got them to organize civics in the evening. I mean, they had a full-time job, and they worked after that. Do we have a generation like that? Do we have our youth? And by youth, I mean anyone between over the age of 18 to 52. Do they have that kind of energy? A full-time job and able 52. To organize after that. House meetings, going to the community, organizing meetings. We need that kind of activism to get us again. And from the old generation, the only active generation I see around the country is the active citizens movement, who are able to do something. And we need that kind of active citizenry to keep and, in a sense, take us to a new direction. Thanks, Chair.
Hi, I'm Tsukuru Mureng. I'm an attorney at the Legal Resources Center. I would just like the panelists, any of the panelists, to just reflect on the strategies that civil society have adopted thus far, whether they have been successful or not, and if they have not been successful, why do they need to change, and if they do need to change, what needs to be done for the strategies to be done better? So yeah, it's somewhat linked to the previous comment. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take a comment from on an online participant.
Sure. Reading a question from Pops Rampasad online. He says, I feel the despair, but as a civil society activist, we dare not drop our guard. I'm concerned of the influence political party office bearers may have on civil society organizations. Can the panel offer a view on how we can entangle, or I suppose disentangle, their influence from the work that we do, which should and must not be aligned to any political party?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Riyad, I'll skip to you there.
Quick couple of things. I do think, you know, a couple of points that made by the panel really hit me, and that is, it is a very different existence to what the majority of us live in the room live compared to the majority of people in the country. Certainly myself, I invested in solar energy a few years ago, so I'm one of the lucky ones. Where I live is not particularly affected badly by water, but what I do think has changed, and something Simon Eppel raised today in an earlier panel, is the level of the crisis is becoming much more intense, and it's beginning to affect middle-class residents severely. And we've got the prospect, once again, I think, of our resourced elements in society coming together with our township-based and rural communities to begin to envision something else. But a political imagination is required in that exercise. And I think, you know, the one other thing is, you know, we were saying, you know, what are we going to be doing in the run-up to the election? It's around the corner. What can we do together? The group I was with Monday and Tuesday were saying, well, Section 24, the right to a clean environment, should be Election 24. The right to water and so on. Now, these things, and I think it's true of Section 25, Section 26 and so on, we can make, I think, hay there. And we will get some resonance, and we can begin to force some level of accountability amongst the candidates and the numerous and diverse people who are standing. So that's the one thing. But I do want to mention something on the desalination plants in the Western Cape, because it relates to Section 24. You know, huge expense to set them up. They were disassembled before the contract time ran out. Why was that? You know, I've looked at the figures of the water that was produced. It was because our wastewater treatment sites and other forms of pollution going out from the rivers into the ocean were creating algae blooms, and therefore reduced the amount of water, making the 48 cents what it normally costs per litre, 4 times the amount the dams cost us, to be completely unsustainable. You know, our destruction of our natural environment is also our destruction of our ability to actually even go into desalination. So I think that raises the final point, and I think I want the panel to address that, is what they're now calling the polycrisis. Something's been popularized from the Davos Forum, how these various crises are coming together to compound the very serious issues we're now facing.
Thank you. Let's come back to the panel for some reaction. Tessa, we'll start with you and we'll come to Thandi, and then Themba, and then Nishan.
Sure. So I put my notes away because this is not the conversation I expected today. So let's go. So the question about where is the political change going to come from? That is going to come from courageous conversations in rooms like this. Because I can tell you the courageous conversations happening in communities that are hardest hit by this is already happening, and that's why you're seeing 300 plus political parties. Because people are willing to politically organize themselves in communities that are hardest hit. Where I'm struggling for us to have the political conversations are in rooms like this, particularly in civil society and business rooms, where there seems to be kind of a block in the air every time we want to have a political conversation. And there's a lack of courage amongst us. There's a lack of courage for us to say what we really think. We're whispering a lot in corridors, guys. We're whispering a lot in corridors and saying things we're not willing to say on platforms in corridors. And until there's courage in rooms like this, and particularly in civil society rooms like this and business rooms like this, where our proximity to power is very, very, very close. Because that's part of the issue, is that we are in rooms where we are one dial away from a minister and a president. And so we're all thinking about the consequence of what happens if I speak up. In communities, that's not the case. And that's why you see over 300 political parties. The country is more ready than we are. And what's needed in order for the kind of moment that you're talking about, Ghulam, in the 80s, is not for organizers and communities to be ready. Organizing communities is happening. What the difference in 1985 and 1983 and 1980s was courageous leadership amongst people who had resource and the network to bring people together to do that and call out a political plan of action. And so when you ask what happens between now and 2024, we must decide what happens between now and 2024. Are we able to say in this room what needs to happen? Should the ANC stay or go? What do we do with the DA? What do we make of the EFF? What do we make of the 300 plus parties that are going to be on that ballot? Can we have a political conversation? And if we can't, then we cannot lead society anywhere. And what will happen is we will continue to have these pockets of discontent blow up community after community, while people look up to us and wait for those of us who have resources, because people are doing this without resources. People are starting entire political parties without any resources in communities. Those of us with resources, those of us with access, those of us with networks that can bring rooms like this together are going to need to do something. Because people who are trying to do something without resources are getting told literally by business units, we cannot fund voter registration without a political principle giving a nod. Voter registration. That's where we are. So there are people and there are civil society organizations that are having conversations about just 3 things towards the 2024 election. And this is even below the bar of having outright conversations about what should happen to which political parties and why. 1, mass voter registration needs to be funded and driven by civil society, regardless of who people vote for. Because, to Gulam's point, the last thing that we have right now to hold on to is the legitimacy of an election. And at our last election in 2021, less than 30% of people who were over the age of 18 showed up. So even that is starting to lose its legitimacy. If we don't get people to show up, we will have a government that will be chosen by the political parties on the ballot and them only. And the legitimacy will be down the toilet. The second thing is we must protect the integrity of that vote next year, and we must not take for granted that if people can use the same office to steal to the bone, that they will not steal an election. We cannot take that for granted anymore. We've seen too much go wrong. And the third thing is we do need to decide what are our demands to the people who want our vote. What are the demands we're willing to make? And how are we going to make sure that they live up to those demands the day after that election? There are more people who are not aligned to political parties than those who are. It is those people who need to win the election in 2024, and that's where political change will come from, the voters.
Can you pass that down this way to Tandi? Tandi, you declared that you are a constitutionalist. And we're having this conversation also in a context where the Constitution comes under attack quite often. So respond in that context, please.
Well, I'm a critical constitutionalist. Well, something that I think we focus a lot on is the process of voting and who we're going to vote for, and I think that is important. But what I'm very concerned about is governance itself. I wonder about what happens when people actually take up office, when they actually have to work in administration, and they're not really mentored in order to take up those positions. I've worked in institutions where private sector appointments come in and they say, oh, you know, the state is so terrible, we can fix it overnight. And invariably, people last 6 months, and then the response is, you know, it's just so dysfunctional, we can't fix it. But it's actually a process. You need to learn about governance as a skill. It's not something that you just do overnight to fix the state. Secondly, I think the other problem is that, you know, South Africa forms part of a global context. We don't focus enough on the role of international organizations on our policy making, the role of external actors and the influences that they have on the direction that our country takes with our development policy, the nature of the power dynamics between global North and South relations, and where South Africa fits in with all those dynamics for us to be where we are domestically. I think something that we really need to start doing less of is looking inward and start understanding that we form part of a global context, and we're currently in a global crisis, both with respect to democracy, with violence and conflict, with environmental degradation, and we are going to start feeling more and more of that impact. With respect to the SDGs or for just transition, I think at least 40% of the resources are going to come from our continent for the global north to meet their environmental justice demands. What does it mean for us? What does it mean for our workers? What does it mean for our industries? What does it mean for our companies? What does it mean for employment? And what does it mean for youth unemployment? I mean, we live on a continent where 2/3 of our population are under the age of 30, and they play no role in our political decision-making processes or our policy-making processes. And that is a real problem. And so to go back to the 80s, I do come from a UDF family, and the majority of people that were conscientized were from the time they were 13, they were already involved in some form of political activity, but they were also respected as leaders of that political activity. They were not shut down or told to respect authority or seniorization of authority. So we really need to start thinking about how we do intergenerational collaboration more, and that we learn from our elders as much as we're able to question them. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Themba, I mean, there's a concern that we might be focusing too much on state capture, when actually the crisis we should be putting our focus on is much bigger than that. And I mean, I want to put this question in this way. The discourse on state capture, the work of the Zondo Commission have given us an entry point. Are we then still focusing too much on state capture? Do we need to move on to hold a different kind of conversation? What do you think?
No, I don't think we should move on, because many of the challenges, and I'm linking this point to something else I want to say, I think there's a convergence of discontent in the country. The poor are worried about what they're going to have for dinner tonight, where they're going to sleep, are they going to have water, jobs, take kids to school, all of those realities. The middle class, those of us around the room, would be concerned about load shedding, would concerned about lack of water in our communities. So the level of discontent is no longer isolated to one class of society or one community. All of us are actually feeling the pinch. And what's missing is actually leadership that could come from here, but also leadership that will enable society to link their day-to-day experiences to something such as state capture. Because state capture is about corruption, those in power stealing resources that are meant to provide those services to communities that are keeping us awake at night. So, I mean, to quote what Pravin Koran used to say, our failure to connect the dots, because a lot of these things are linked. State capture, poverty, poor service delivery, you can actually bring it down to state capture. So unless we have a good and better understanding of the conditions that led to state capture and the impact of state capture on our lives. So we cannot say state capture debate is over. It's actually with us, and chances are that it's likely to be with us for many decades to come, unless we come up with ideas in rooms such as this one about what needs to be done to prevent further occurrence of state capture in our society. Remember that when the Zondo Commission was taking place, there were state capture projects that were unfolding during the commission. The Zondo Commission only focused on one aspect of state capture. It never looked at what's happening at provincial level. It never looked at, most importantly, at what is happening at local government, where municipalities are being captured by corrupt business people who are conniving with politicians and local government officials to steal resources of the public, not of the state. So I think that it would be a mistake for us to say we're focusing too much on state capture, because state capture is essentially about a form of corruption that has put us where we are, where the state does not have capacity at all to deliver services to communities. Where is this change going to come from, though? There's a question posed by Carol. I think that the change is going to come from the bottom. So there's convergence. Many citizens in this country who are sitting here are unhappy, but they're failing to see or connect the links between what's happening at government level, the corruption, state capture that is continuing to this day. and their day-to-day lived experiences. That's the problem. And unless we find ways of getting young people, the unemployed, the poor, and also you mentioned the working class working people, unless they begin to understand that, in fact, a lot of their day-to-day problems have everything to do with corruption, or we may use the phrase state capture. So we need to find ways of better mobilizing those communities. And that's why I bring the question of leadership, because what happened after 1994 is that we sort of surrendered our role as activists to politicians, because a perception was created that when you elect people to parliament, they will solve our problems. So the past 25 years have demonstrated to us that if you just think that by casting a vote, your life will change, you're making a mistake. You need to find ways of remaining involved and making sure that those you choose as your leaders actually serve your interests. At this stage, the people who are in political organizations, most of them, are actually looking after their own interests and not the interests of citizens. So our role as activists in civil society is to actually go back to communities to organize them. Change did not come in this country because of political parties or political organizations. It came because the ordinary citizens said enough is enough. Today, how many of us have access to talking to youngsters, the unemployed, working people, to say, our country is going the wrong direction, what are we going to do about it? Are we using the correct platforms to make sure that we reach out to those communities? So as she said, my fellow panelists has said, all of us are operating in silos. The question to the point about strategies for civil society. We're operating in silos. We're silent on issues affecting our citizens on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of our strategies tend to focus on the middle classes, the educated, people such as ourselves. So we are talking to ourselves and not talking to citizens who could actually make the change. So the major change that needs to happen is to begin to make sure that our strategies as civil society talk to the challenges facing our citizens, and also beginning to not just organize protests. I think protests are important, but we need to begin to put alternatives on the table to say, these are the changes we are going to fight for. As people are thinking about voting in the elections next year, we should be posing questions to say, make an informed choice about where you're going to put your X. Because a lot of people just say, I'm going to vote for the party that I've always voted for, and not linking that to the fact that they are suffering on a day-to-day basis. So educate the citizens to say, as you're standing in those long queues to cast your vote, be sure about what exactly you are voting for and which party you think is closer to what your interests are as citizens. And I think that's what the issue of mobilizing society becomes very important. And that's the role I think civil society needs to do more, to just make sure that we find resources to educate our communities and our societies.
Thank you. Sean, let's come to you. Are we too cozy with power? And does defend our democracy just speak and do no more?
Yeah, no, well, Defend Our Democracy can answer that, I think, misplaced view. Because the Defend Our Democracy that I know has an incredibly number of young people who lead it today. So maybe Carol is talking about some other movement that I'm not aware of. And perhaps it's a mistake on our part not to have sent the briefings to her. I generally think that civil society has been doing a lot of work. You know, there's the procurement working group, the state capture working group, OUTA, PARI, KSEC, Whistleblower House, Unite Behind, Freedom Under Law, the Council of Churches, media. And our work relates to advocacy, policy reform, litigation, research, publications, training, education. But the last time that we had more than 10,000 people out onto the streets was 2017. And that's where our weaknesses are. And because we've stopped doing that, you create the environment for those who feel that being implicated in state capture and the Zondo Commission is nothing to be ashamed of. So they're emboldened. They go to the churches, the mosques, the temples, and they're treated as celebrities. They're actually treated as celebrities. And now they get appointed to boards because there's a feeling that nobody's going to object. I asked Dave, I said, Makura had set up a Gauteng ethics committee. Did this ethics committee deal with this issue? He says they are going to deal with it. And it's happening across the board. Because as much as we do good work, we are also weak at communicating, at trying to figure out what can we do collectively. And that's our biggest weakness. We all want our limelight. We all have to please our donors. But we don't talk about what we must do collectively. And then we have forums like this, very useful. But even out of a forum like this, when we leave, we will not have one thing that we will have in common that we must act on tomorrow. And that's a weakness. It's a weakness when we spend time and money like this and we can't come out of here and say, what do we do? Now, even if we were to go from here tomorrow and say, every organization, take the Babita Deokaran documentary and screen it. We've done this in communities across this province. The last one was in Tembisa. A huge hall full of young people, but also teachers and people from the police station and some from the hospital. And for many, it was the first time that they understood what was happening in the hospital. They couldn't draw the links. And that's the other issue. We must not assume that people understand the details of what has happened in state capture. It has been an overwhelming amount of information. And I don't think many of us here can name the culprits. I don't think we can even recognize them if we see them. More so for people who are not dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. So I think that there is scope for civil society to actually go and do grassroots work. If each and every one of us were to say, I'm adopting a particular area, and if there's a common agenda to deal with how we educate and mobilize around corruption and state capture, then we would be able to do that. But many are 9-to-5 organizations, Monday to Friday. I think two last points. I'm not one that wants to say, because of my gray beard, I must take a backseat role. I think I'm trying to find the words, but I think it's wrong to say that young people who might not have created the mess must now come and fix it up. I work with young people every day, and I think maybe that gives me the energy to match them. But I think we have a huge responsibility to match their energy and not to recede into the background and sit on our couches or on social media. The absence of victories demoralizes. But yeah, unite behind. Scored, I think some people might say it's not important, but a very significant victory to get Tipo Peters banned. Now, okay, she gets banned for a single term in parliament. There's no monetary loss and whatever else. But it is a significant victory that the ethics committee was forced to deal with this thing. We don't celebrate it. We don't replicate it. I think just to end, we're doing work around the city of Joburg. 2 big public convenings have happened in the last 3 months. I am amazed at just the degree of organizations, suburban areas. It is just mind-blowing how people have organized. And when they get into a room and look at the commonality of experience of not having water, rich, white, black, white, rich, poor, across geography, it suddenly comes to mind that they need to now act against a municipality that is dysfunctional and that needs to be changed. And I think we must find the common ground that brings people together continuously to tackle these issues. There is not a shortage of issues. There's a shortage of leaders who can bring people together and dump some of the narrow ideological dogmas that sometimes inhibit us from doing what is required. Thanks.
Thank you. We are down to the last 5 minutes, and I'm going to take 2 more comments from the floor, and that will bring us to the end of our time. David, and one more. LaRue.
Thanks. You know, I think that the difference between Ghulam's 1980s and now is not in the bravery of the leaders, but in the fact that in the 1980s we had a route to political power. We the first and second tier, and maybe further tiers below, of the UDF were all ANC leaders, and the UDF was the above ground organization of the ANC, and we knew that we were going to get political power out of our activity, or at least that's what we were fighting for. Now, even though I have many ministers on my telephone connection and whatever, I feel very distant from power, much more distant than I did or me and my comrades did then, even though I was never particularly enamored of the ANC, I'll say in my defense. But where is the route to political power now? It's not in the 2024 election. I mean, I'll go to the 2024 election and I'll vote for a splinter party of some sort as a kind of protest vote, but there is no access to the 3 main political parties in the country, not to the ANC, not to the EFF, and not to the DA. And there's particularly no access for young people. I mean, their youth organizations are, if anything, more venal and corrupt than their mother bodies. So I think, I mean, and following Shan, I think the seminal election that is coming is not the 2024 election, it's the 2026 election. And it seems to me that there's time and there's space to organize the kind of alliances that Shan is talking about that would allow us to capture political power and aim for that and galvanize people around that in Johannesburg, in Ekurhuleni, particularly in the big metros. And with access to that kind of political power, you can leverage that up into the provinces, into the nationals, and eventually into either working with one or other of these splinter political parties who seem more hopeful, or new political parties can be formed, or even maybe the existing political parties can be transformed, which I'm not hell of optimistic about. But it's that access to political power that now, that in 1980s wasn't closed, in fact it was wide open, and now seems very, very closed. And I think that 2026 election, particularly as we have 2 years to do something about it, is, I think, really going to be the make or break moment in a new politics.
Thanks. I think we have to thank Pari and Kasak for keeping the Zondo report alive over the last 2 days, and there's been a lot of interesting talk about what's already been done and what can still be done in that regard. I think one of the disappointments was the direct recommendation to be more constituency based in the elections, in our electoral system. And that has been sidestepped and ignored. I mean, they brought in independence, which was not really part of Zondo recommendations anyway. But to hold political representatives accountable and a constituency base was just totally ignored. So we will move into a next election without that again. And I think I like what Tessa said about there's certain things that you don't have to argue about. Voter registration everybody should be promoting that over the next few months. Similarly, protecting the integrity of the election. The worst possible outcome can be a disputed one, where we are in war about what the outcome might be. But I'm not. I think what is so different from 85 is there will be an election next year. And somewhere in May, every one of us will walk into a voting booth. And you'll have a choice in front of you. And you can vote for the same if you want the same for the next 5 years. Or if you're desperate, you can vote for something worse. Or you can try and vote for something better. And I think, Dave, we have to forget that there will be a prominent political party that will take us into a glowing future. We are in for coalition politics. So you have to vote for what you think can deliver for you. Just looking around, you can vote for better service delivery. There are examples. You can vote for less unemployment. There are examples. You can vote for better governance. There are examples. And it'll be your choice. And then once we voted, we'll have to see that we keep those people accountable. In the same way that we do now, but at least we should vote. And vote for change. Because otherwise, we will be really foolish. Thanks.
Thank you. So we've come to the end of our time. Thank you for those last comments. Okay, Tessa wants to have a final comment. You have 1 minute, Tessa.
There was this kind of pessimism about 24 that I felt coming from that comment. And for me, 24 is not the beginning. It's not the end, it's the beginning. But we must not miss the opportunity to start mobilizing. Building power is going to take a long time. But what I worry about is if we don't build any power towards 2024 and we allow people just to collapse into despair, that's even more dangerous. It will take us much longer. People will start to lose faith in the entirety of the democratic edifice for sure. And so I think 2024, that's why I say for me, 2024 is the voters' election. The voter must win. The voter must feel like the voter has done something. We take all of this polling for granted, and we assume we know it's going to be 40% or 30% or whatever. My hope for the 2024 election is that the voter completely throws the entire apple cart up. And everything we think we know, we don't, because voters show up for themselves in ways that we don't see coming. It's like a protest, but at the polls.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking this panel for a stimulating discussion.